The billionaire's enemy tried to kidnap him, but the maid's sleeping toddler saved everything. The morning sun cast golden rays through the towering windows of the Blackwood estate, illuminating marble floors that gleamed like mirrors. At 32 years old, Alexander Blackwood had built an empire that most men could only dream of, tech innovations that had revolutionized communication, investments that had multiplied into billions, and a name that commanded respect in every boardroom from New York to Tokyo. Yet for all his wealth and success, Alexander lived in a fortress of solitude. The mansion sprawled across 5 acres of prime Manhattan real estate, with 23 bedrooms, an Olympic-sized pool, and security systems that rivaled those of foreign embassies. But emptiness echoed through its halls. Alexander's days were filled with board meetings, conference calls, and strategic negotiations. His nights were spent alone, reviewing portfolios and planning the next big acquisition. That was until Maria Sanchez arrived. Maria was 28 years old, with warm brown eyes that crinkled when she smiled and hands that had known hard work since childhood. She had come to America from a small village in Mexico 7 years ago, carrying nothing but hope and determination. She'd worked 3 jobs to send money home to her aging parents, scrubbing floors at office buildings, washing dishes at restaurants, and cleaning homes for families who barely acknowledged her presence. Then she had Lily. Her daughter was an unexpected blessing, born from a brief relationship that ended when the father disappeared upon hearing the news. Maria had faced that crossroads that so many single mothers know: despair or determination. She chose the latter. She chose to fight for her daughter with every breath in her body. Lily was now 2 years old, with her mother's dark curls and a smile that could light up the darkest room. She was Maria's entire world, her reason for waking up each morning, her motivation to keep pushing forward despite the exhaustion that settled into her bones. When Maria applied for the housekeeping position at the Blackwood estate, she had been honest about her situation. She needed a live-in position because childcare costs were drowning her. Most employers had turned her away immediately. A child was a complication, a distraction, a liability. But Alexander had surprised her. "Bring her," he had said simply, his steel-gray eyes softening for just a moment. "The East Wing has quarters with a separate bedroom. It's just sitting empty anyway." Maria had nearly wept with gratitude. The salary he offered was more than her 3 previous jobs combined, and having Lily with her meant no more agonizing separations, no more wondering if her daughter was safe while she worked 16-hour days. They had been at the mansion for 3 months now, and Maria had transformed it from a cold showpiece into something that felt almost like a home. Fresh flowers graced the entrance hall. The scent of home-cooked meals wafted from the kitchen. And sometimes, when Lily's laughter echoed through the corridors as she chased after dust motes in the afternoon sunlight, even Alexander would pause in his work and smile. He had never expected to care about his housekeeper and her daughter. Alexander Blackwood didn't do attachment. It was a weakness, a vulnerability that his years in cutthroat business had taught him to avoid. But there was something about Maria's quiet dignity, the way she hummed old Mexican lullabies while she worked, the fierce love in her eyes whenever she looked at her daughter. And Lily, that child had somehow wormed her way into his heavily guarded heart. She would toddle into his study sometimes, when Maria was occupied with laundry or preparing dinner, clutching her worn stuffed rabbit and looking up at him with those impossibly wide eyes. At first, Alexander had been uncertain, awkward with the tiny human invading his space. But Lily was undeterred by his stern expressions or his attempts to continue working. She would simply settle on the floor near his desk, babbling to her rabbit in a mixture of Spanish and English, occasionally offering him crayon drawings of indecipherable shapes that she insisted were Mr. Alex. Despite himself, Alexander kept every single drawing. Maria watched these interactions with a mixture of gratitude and concern. She knew her employer was a good man beneath his icy exterior, but she also knew the dangers that came with his world. She'd overheard phone conversations conducted in clipped, angry tones. She'd seen the security footage showing men in dark cars parked across the street, watching the mansion. She'd noticed the way Alexander's jaw would tighten when certain names were mentioned in business news. There were enemies circling, She could feel it. Marcus Hendricks was the name that appeared most frequently in those tense conversations. Alexander's former business partner, the man who had tried to steal proprietary technology and sell it to competitors overseas. Alexander had caught him, prosecuted him, and sent him to federal prison for corporate espionage. Marcus had been released 6 months ago, and the hatred in his public statements about Alexander Blackwood was visceral and frightening. But Maria kept her concerns to herself. This was a good job, a safe place for Lily, and she couldn't afford to let fear drive her away from the stability they desperately needed. On this particular morning, as Maria polished the silver in the dining room, Lily played nearby with her collection of plastic cups and wooden spoons, creating a symphony of noise that would have driven most people mad, but that Maria found comforting. Alexander had already left for his downtown office, his security detail flanking him as always. The mansion felt peaceful, almost serene. Maria had no way of knowing that in less than 12 hours, that peace would shatter into 1,000 pieces. She had no way of knowing that the enemies Alexander had made in his ruthless climb to the top were closer than anyone realized. And she certainly had no way of knowing that her innocent toddler daughter, who was currently trying to fit a too large cup onto her small head, would become the unlikely hero in a nightmare that none of them saw coming. As the afternoon sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Maria finished her work and scooped Lily into her arms. "Time for dinner, mi amor," she whispered, pressing a kiss to her daughter's forehead. Lily giggled and wrapped her small arms around her mother's neck, content and safe in the only world she knew, a world that was about to be tested in ways that would change all their lives forever. Marcus Hendricks sat in the dimly lit warehouse in Brooklyn, his fingers drumming against the scarred wooden table with barely contained fury. 5 years in federal prison had done nothing to diminish his hatred. If anything, it had concentrated it, distilled it into something pure and poisonous that consumed his every waking thought. Alexander Blackwood had taken everything from him. The business they'd built together, the reputation Marcus had spent decades cultivating, his freedom, his family. His wife had divorced him while he was inside, taking their 2 sons and moving across the country to escape the scandal. His own mother had stopped accepting his calls from prison after the 2nd year. All because Alexander Blackwood couldn't keep his mouth shut, couldn't look the other way, couldn't understand that sometimes rules needed to be bent in the name of profit. "It's all confirmed," said Vincent Cole, Marcus's former head of security and the only person who had remained loyal through the trial and imprisonment. Vincent was a broad-shouldered man with cold eyes and a military background that made him efficient and merciless in equal measure. Blackwood returns to the mansion every night at 7:30. His security detail does a perimeter check, and then 2 guards remain inside, one at the main entrance and one in the security office monitoring cameras. "What about the rest of the staff?" Marcus asked, his voice low and controlled despite the rage simmering beneath. "Minimal. He's got a housekeeper, some Mexican woman with a kid. They live in the East Wing. The chef comes in 3 times a week, but doesn't stay overnight. Cleaning crew comes on Saturdays. Otherwise, it's just Blackwood rattling around in that massive place." Marcus smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Perfect. When do we move?" "Tonight," Vincent said. "I've got 3 men positioned. We'll cut the power to disable the cameras, go in through the service entrance. I've got keys from my time working security systems in that neighborhood. We grab Blackwood, get him out before anyone knows what's happening. And then," Marcus leaned forward, his eyes glittering with anticipation. "Then he signs over controlling shares of Blackwood Technologies to you. He transfers $200 million in liquid assets. He releases a statement saying you were innocent, that he fabricated evidence. And then," Vincent paused, meeting his employer's gaze steadily. "Then he disappears. Permanently." Marcus nodded slowly. People might have called it murder. He called it justice. They had tried legal channels. Marcus's lawyers had filed appeal after appeal, but Alexander's evidence had been too solid, too damning. The court of public opinion had already convicted Marcus before the trial even began. His attempts to rebuild his reputation after release had failed spectacularly. No one wanted to associate with a convicted felon. no matter how much he protested his innocence. So, if the system wouldn't give him justice, he'd take it himself. What about the housekeeper and the kid? Vincent asked, his tone neutral. Marcus waved a dismissive hand. Collateral damage. Lock them in their rooms. If they see anything, we'll deal with it. But they're not the priority. Vincent nodded and left to finalize preparations, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts and his hatred. Meanwhile, across the city, Alexander sat in his corner office overlooking Manhattan, oblivious to the danger brewing. He was reviewing quarterly reports, but his mind kept drifting. Unusual for him. He prided himself on his focus, his ability to compartmentalize and concentrate on the task at hand. But lately, things had been different. The mansion didn't feel as empty anymore. He found himself leaving work earlier than usual, arriving home at 7:30 instead of 9 or 10. He told himself it was about maintaining a healthy work-life balance, but the truth was more complicated. He'd come home to find Maria in the kitchen, preparing meals that filled the house with warmth and delicious aromas that reminded him of childhood visits to his grandmother's house, back before wealth and ambition had complicated everything. She would look up and smile, wiping flour from her hands, asking about his day with genuine interest that no one else seemed to have. And Lily would rush to him, as if his arrival was the highlight of her day. She'd grab his hand with her sticky toddler fingers and drag him to see whatever she'd been playing with, chattering in her half-English, half-Spanish way that he found utterly charming despite himself. Last week, he'd found himself sitting on the floor of his study, helping her stack blocks, and he couldn't remember the last time he'd felt so content, so peaceful. His phone buzzed with a text from his head of security. Possible threat detected. Marcus Hendricks's known associates spotted in Manhattan. Recommend increased vigilance. Alexander frowned but dismissed it. Marcus was always making noise, always posting angry rants on social media about supposed injustices. The man was all talk, surely. Still, he forwarded the message to Vincent. Wait, no, Vincent had left his security team months ago. To Rodriguez, the new head of security. Double the guards tonight, he texted back. And run a full diagnostic on the security systems. Rodriguez confirmed the instructions, and Alexander returned to his reports. But concentration eluded him. Finally, at 6:30, he shut down his computer and headed home. He'd been doing that more often lately, prioritizing being home. He told himself it was about security, about being present in case of threats. But deep down, he knew it was simpler than that. He was tired of being alone. When he arrived at the mansion at 7:30, right on schedule, Maria was in the kitchen preparing dinner. The scent of chicken enchiladas filled the air, and he found himself smiling despite the stress of the day. Mr. Blackwood. Lily's excited voice rang out as she appeared in the foyer, her little legs pumping as she ran toward him, her stuffed rabbit dragging behind her. You home? He caught her as she launched herself at his legs, and for a moment, he allowed himself to ruffle her dark curls affectionately. I'm home, Pequeña. Maria appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron, her face breaking into a warm smile that made something in his chest tighten inexplicably. Dinner will be ready in 20 minutes, Mr. Blackwood. Call me Alexander, he said, as he had many times before. And as always, she nodded but would likely continue to call him Mr. Blackwood out of respect. He didn't know that these would be among the last peaceful moments any of them would experience for a very long time. He didn't know that Marcus Hendricks's men were already in position, waiting for darkness to fall. He didn't know that the security systems he trusted so completely had already been compromised by Vincent Cole's inside knowledge. All he knew was that for the first time in years, coming home felt like actually coming home. And sometimes he was learning that feeling was worth more than all the billions in his bank account. The power went out at 10:47 p.m. Alexander was in his study, reviewing contracts by lamplight, a habit from his early days when he couldn't afford to stop working, even during power outages in his first cramped apartment. When the lamp flickered and died, along with every other light in the mansion, his first thought was a simple electrical failure. His second thought, arriving half a heartbeat later with cold clarity, was, this is an attack. He was reaching for his phone when he heard the crash of breaking glass from the ground floor, followed by heavy footsteps, multiple sets, moving with military precision. Alexander's security training kicked in immediately. He'd taken courses, prepared for scenarios exactly like this. He knew that his panic room was 30 feet away through a hidden panel behind the bookshelf. He could make it in less than 10 seconds. But then he heard Maria scream. The sound froze his blood. It was a mother's scream, primal and terrified, coming from the East Wing where she and Lily slept. Without thinking, without calculating odds or considering strategy, Alexander ran toward the sound. The mansion was pitch black, but he knew every inch of it. He navigated by memory, his hands finding walls and door frames by instinct. Behind him, he could hear the intruders shouting to each other, their flashlight beams cutting through the darkness like searchlights. Find Blackwood. He couldn't have gone far. He recognized that voice. Vincent Cole, his former security expert, the man who knew every detail of this mansion's layout and defensive systems. The betrayal stung, but Alexander had no time to process it. He had to reach Maria and Lily. In the East Wing, Maria had been awakened by the power outage but hadn't been truly alarmed until she heard the breaking glass. She'd worked enough wealthy homes to know the sound of a break-in, and her first instinct was to protect her daughter. She'd scooped Lily from her small bed, the child barely stirring, still deep in the heavy sleep of toddlerhood, and carried her to the bathroom, the only room with a lock. Her hands shook as she turned the bolt, her mind racing through options. Call 911. Her phone. She needed her phone. But she'd left it charging in the bedroom, and now there were footsteps in the hallway outside their quarters. Heavy boots, multiple people, and they were trying the door to her rooms. Anyone in here? A gruff voice called out. Maria held Lily tighter, pressing her hand gently over her daughter's mouth, even though the child was still sleeping soundly. She'd always been a deep sleeper, thank God. Even now, with her mother's heart hammering so hard it felt like it might break through her ribs, Lily slept on, her small body warm and trusting in Maria's arms. The door to their quarters crashed open. They'd kicked it in. Check everywhere, another voice commanded. The housekeeper might know where Blackwood keeps his private documents. And make sure there are no witnesses. Maria felt tears streaming down her face. She thought of her parents back in Mexico, who would never know what happened to their daughter and granddaughter. She thought of all the dreams she'd had for Lily's future, college, a career, a life free from the struggles Maria had endured. The bathroom door, handle rattled. Locked, someone said. Want me to break it down? Do it quick. We need to find Blackwood before. The voice was cut off by a sudden commotion in the hallway. Shouting, the sound of a struggle, something heavy hitting the wall. Alexander had arrived. He'd grabbed a decorative metal sculpture from a hallway table, a heavy modernist piece that his interior decorator had insisted would make a statement, and swung it at the first intruder he encountered. The man went down hard, his flashlight skittering across the floor. But there were 3 more, and they recovered quickly from their surprise. Vincent's voice cut through the chaos. Blackwood. Stand down, or we kill the woman and her kid. Alexander froze. The sculpture fell from his nerveless fingers with a heavy thud. Vincent's flashlight beam found his face, blinding him momentarily. That's better. Now, you're going to come with us, very quietly. You're going to sign some documents. Transfer some assets. And if you cooperate, maybe, we let the housekeeper and her brat live. Inside the bathroom, Maria heard every word. She also heard the resignation in Alexander's voice when he said, Fine, I'll do whatever you want. Just don't hurt them. She closed her eyes, tears flowing faster. This good man, this billionaire who'd shown her and Lily kindness when the world had shown them nothing but hardship, was about to sacrifice himself for them. And she was powerless to help him. But then Lily stirred in her arms. The toddler's eyes fluttered open, confused by the darkness and the unfamiliar position. She was disoriented, not fully awake, and in that confused state between sleep and waking, she did what she'd been taught to do if there was ever an emergency. Lily's small hand reached out and somehow, by pure chance, by divine intervention, by the universe's strange sense of timing, grabbed Maria's phone from the bathroom counter where Maria had placed it earlier that evening after giving Lily her bath. The child didn't understand what was happening. She only knew that her mother was holding her very tightly and that there were scary loud noises outside. In her confused, half-asleep state, Lily did the one thing her mother had practiced with her over and over during their safety drills. She pressed the big red button on the phone screen, the emergency button that Maria had set up months ago, teaching Lily that if Mama was ever hurt or scared, this button would bring help. The phone, already unlocked because Maria had been using it before bed, immediately dialed 911. Lily dropped the phone, the effort exhausting her limited toddler attention span, and burrowed back into her mother's arms, already drifting back to sleep, unaware that she'd just set in motion the events that would save all their lives. In the hallway, Vincent was binding Alexander's hands with zip ties, unaware that in less than 3 minutes, police dispatch would receive a call from this address. Unaware that the open line would transmit every word being spoken. Unaware that his entire plan was unraveling because of a sleepy 2-year-old's accidental heroism. "Let's move," Marcus Hendricks's voice came from the stairway. He'd been waiting outside, too cautious to enter until his men had secured the situation. "Get him to the van. We'll take him to the warehouse, make him sign everything, and then—" "Sir," one of the men interrupted, holding up a small device. "I'm picking up an active phone signal. Someone made a call." Everyone froze. Vincent's eyes went to the bathroom door, and realization dawned. The housekeeper. She must have had her phone with her. Marcus's face contorted with rage. "Then we have maybe 5 minutes before police arrive. Kill them both. Kill them now, and let's get out of here." Maria heard these words through the bathroom door, and her blood turned to ice. She looked down at her sleeping daughter, at this precious life she'd fought so hard to protect, and she knew with terrible certainty that she couldn't save them. But she would try. God help her, she would try. She started to stand, to put herself between the door and Lily, to buy even a few more seconds with her own body if necessary. And then Alexander's voice rang out, clear and commanding despite his bound hands. "You kill them, and you get nothing. I'll never sign your documents. I'll never transfer a penny. You'll have committed murder for nothing, and you'll spend the rest of your life in a cell, Marcus." The silence that followed was deafening. Time became elastic in the darkness of that hallway. Seconds stretched into eternities. Hearts beat like war drums. And in the bathroom, Maria held her daughter and prayed harder than she'd ever prayed in her life. Outside the bathroom door, Marcus Hendricks was calculating. He could hear sirens in the distance now, faint, but growing closer. His years in business had taught him to assess risk versus reward, to know when to push forward and when to cut losses. This was quickly becoming a loss. "We have maybe 3 minutes, Vincent said, his voice tight with tension. "We need to decide now." Marcus looked at Alexander, at this man who had destroyed his life, who stood before him bound and vulnerable. It would be so easy to pull the trigger, to end it all right here. But Alexander was right. Without those signed documents, without the transfers, this whole operation was pointless. And a murder charge would ensure he never saw freedom again. "Take him," Marcus finally spat. "Leave the woman and kid. We'll deal with Blackwood at the warehouse, force his cooperation there." Vincent nodded and grabbed Alexander's arm, but Alexander resisted. "I'm not going anywhere until I know they're safe. You leave them locked in that bathroom, and you leave now. That's the deal." "You're not in a position to make deals," Marcus snarled. "Actually, I am." Alexander's voice was steady, almost conversational, despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "You need me alive and cooperative. And I'm telling you right now, if anything happens to Maria or Lily, I will make it my life's mission to ensure you face the maximum penalty for every crime you've committed tonight. But if you leave them unharmed, I'll sign whatever you want. I'll transfer the money. I'll say whatever you need me to say." It was a lie, of course. Alexander had no intention of giving this man anything. He just needed to buy time until the police arrived. But Marcus, blinded by greed and years of resentment, wanted to believe him. The sirens were closer now. Much closer. "Move," Marcus commanded, and Vincent dragged Alexander toward the service stairs, the same route they'd used to enter. The other men followed, their flashlights bobbing in the darkness like malevolent fireflies. As their footsteps faded, Maria remained frozen in the bathroom, still clutching Lily. She could hear the sirens now, too, and she heard the distant crash of the front door being smashed open, heard police officers shouting commands. But she didn't move. Couldn't move. The terror had locked her muscles in place. It wasn't until a female officer gently knocked on the bathroom door, calling out, "Hey, ma'am, are you in there? You're safe now," that Maria finally released the breath she'd been holding. Her hands shook so badly she could barely turn the lock. When the door opened, revealing the officer's concerned face and the flashlights of multiple officers behind her, Maria collapsed. "My daughter," she gasped. "Please, my daughter." "She's fine," the officer said gently, helping Maria to her feet. "You're both fine. You're safe now." But they weren't all safe. Alexander was gone. As the officers swept through the mansion, securing the scene and checking for additional intruders, Maria explained everything through tears: the break-in, the threats, Mr. Blackwood's sacrifice to save them. She described the men as best she could, repeated every word she'd heard through the bathroom door. Detective Sarah Chin arrived within 15 minutes, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who immediately took command of the scene. She listened to Maria's statement with intense focus, recording every detail. "You said one of them was named Vincent?" Detective Chun asked. "Yes, and they mentioned Marcus Hendricks, I think. Mr. Blackwood has talked about him before. He's an enemy, someone who went to prison because of Mr. Blackwood." Detective Chen's expression darkened. Marcus Hendricks had been on their radar since his release from federal prison. They'd suspected he might try something against Blackwood, but they hadn't acted quickly enough. "We're tracking Mr. Blackwood's phone now," she told Maria. "And we've issued a bolo. Be on the lookout for Hendricks and his known associates. We'll find him." Maria nodded numbly, but her thoughts were spiraling. Mr. Blackwood, Alexander, had saved them. He'd put himself in danger, had allowed himself to be taken, all to protect her and Lily. And now he was in the hands of men who wanted him dead. She looked down at Lily, who had slept through most of the chaos and was only now starting to wake up, confused by all the strange people and flashing lights. "Mama," the little girl said sleepily, rubbing her eyes. "What happening?" "Nothing, mi amor," Maria whispered, pulling her daughter close. "Everything is okay now." But it wasn't okay. It wouldn't be okay until Alexander was home safe. Meanwhile, in a van speeding through Brooklyn, Alexander was calculating his own odds. His hands were bound behind his back, zip ties cutting into his wrists. Marcus sat across from him, a gun resting casually on his knee, while Vincent drove with the focused intensity of a man who knew they were racing against time. "You're making a mistake," Alexander said calmly. "The police know about you, Marcus. They'll have roadblocks up already. You're not getting away with this." "Shut up," Marcus snapped, but there was uncertainty in his eyes now. The plan had gone sideways. Instead of a clean extraction with plenty of time to force Blackwood's cooperation, they were now fugitives with every cop in New York looking for them. Vincent's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, and his face went pale. "Boss, we've got a problem. Multiple units are setting up checkpoints on all major routes out of Manhattan." Marcus cursed viciously. "Then we use the warehouse. We hole up there, finish what we started, and figure out our exit strategy." But Alexander could see the cracks forming. These men were desperate now, and desperate men made mistakes. He just needed to stay alive long enough for those mistakes to compound. The warehouse in Brooklyn was one of Marcus's remaining assets, a rundown property in a neglected industrial area. When they pulled inside, Vincent and another man hauled Alexander out of the van and dragged him to a metal chair, securing him with more zip ties. Marcus paced in front of him like a caged animal, the gun swinging loosely in his hand. "Here's how this is going to work," he said, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage. "You're going to use your laptop. Yes, We brought your laptop from the study to initiate transfers from your accounts to mine. You're going to draft a statement saying you fabricated evidence against me. And you're going to do it now." "No," Alexander said simply. The gun was at his head in an instant. "I will kill you. Then you get nothing," Alexander replied, meeting Marcus's eyes steadily. "Your choice." For a moment, they were frozen there. The billionaire bound to a chair, the vengeful ex-partner with a gun to his head, and the warehouse silent except for their breathing and the distant sound of police sirens that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere all at once. Marcus's hand was shaking. His finger was on the trigger. And Alexander realized with crystal clarity that this man might actually do it, might throw away everything for the satisfaction of revenge. But then Vincent's phone rang, and the sound shattered the moment. "It's Rodriguez," Vincent said, looking at the screen. "Your head of security." "Answer it," Marcus commanded. "Put it on speaker." Vincent complied, and Rodriguez's voice filled the warehouse. "Vincent, I know you can hear me. I know you're with Hendricks and Blackwood. And I know you're in that warehouse in Brooklyn. We've been tracking you." Alexander felt a surge of hope. His new head of security was better than he'd given him credit for. "You've got two choices," Rodriguez continued. "You can release Mr. Blackwood now and surrender, in which case we might be able to work out a deal. Or you can force this to go bad, and I guarantee you won't like how it ends. SWAT teams are already en route to your location." Marcus's face went through a series of expressions: fury, fear, calculation, desperation. And then, slowly, something broke in him. The gun lowered. His shoulders sagged. "It's over," he whispered. "It's all over." Vincent made a different calculation. He'd been in enough tactical situations to know when the odds were insurmountable. He set down his weapon and put his hands up. "I'm out. I didn't sign up for a suicide mission." The other men followed his lead, and suddenly Marcus was alone. Alone with his hatred and his gun, and the man he'd wanted to destroy. For a long moment, Alexander thought Marcus might shoot him anyway, might choose revenge over survival. But then the older man's hand opened, and the gun clattered to the concrete floor. "I hope you're happy," Marcus said bitterly. "You've destroyed me twice now." "I didn't destroy you," Alexander replied quietly. "You destroyed yourself. I just refused to go down with you." 10 minutes later, police swarmed the warehouse. Alexander was cut free from his restraints and checked by paramedics. Marcus and his accomplices were arrested, read their rights, and taken away in handcuffs. And through it all, Alexander could think of only one thing: getting home to make sure Maria and Lily were truly okay. Dawn broke over Manhattan in shades of pink and gold, painting the city with gentle light that seemed almost apologetic after the violence of the previous night. Alexander sat in the back of a police cruiser, his choice, as he'd refused the ambulance despite the paramedics' insistence that he needed to be checked for shock and injuries. He had a split lip from when Vincent had struck him during the struggle in the hallway, bruises forming on his arms where he'd been grabbed and restrained, and cuts on his wrists from the zip ties. But he barely felt any of it. His mind was elsewhere, already back at the mansion. Detective Chin sat in the front passenger seat, twisted around to face him. "Mr. Blackwood, we'll need a full statement, but that can wait until you've had some rest. You've been through." "I want to go home," Alexander interrupted. "Please. I need to see Maria and Lily." The detective studied him for a moment, then nodded to the driver. "Take him home." The mansion was still lit up with police vehicles when they arrived, crime scene tape fluttering in the early morning breeze. Officers were documenting evidence, taking photographs, dusting for fingerprints. The broken glass from the service entrance crunched under Alexander's feet as he entered his own home, and the sound made him flinch. Rodriguez met him in the foyer, relief evident on his weathered face. "Sir, thank God you're all right. Miss Sanchez and her daughter are in the kitchen. She refused to leave, said she needed to wait for you." Alexander moved through his mansion as if in a dream. The familiar spaces felt different now, violated by the violence that had invaded them. But when he reached the kitchen doorway and saw Maria sitting at the table with Lily in her lap, both of them safe and whole, he felt something crack open in his chest. Maria's head snapped up at his entrance. Her eyes were red-rimmed from crying, dark circles of exhaustion underneath them. But when she saw him, her face transformed with relief so profound it was almost painful to witness. "Mr. Blackwood," she breathed, starting to stand, but Alexander was already moving toward them. He knelt in front of her chair, his hands coming up to frame her face gently, his eyes searching hers. "Are you okay? Both of you? Did they hurt you?" "We're fine," Maria whispered, tears spilling over again. "But your face, your wrists." Her fingers touched his injuries with feather-light concern. "I'm fine," he assured her, though his voice was rough. "I'm so sorry, Maria. I'm so sorry you had to go through that I brought that danger into your life, into Lily's life." "No," she said firmly, her hands moving to cover his. "You saved us. You sacrificed yourself to save us." Lily, who had been watching this exchange with wide, solemn eyes, suddenly reached out and patted Alexander's bruised cheek with her small hand. "Mr. Alex hurt?" she asked, her voice concerned. "Just a little, pequeña," he said, managing a smile for her. "But I'm okay now." "Kiss better?" Lily offered, and before he could respond, she leaned forward and pressed a gentle kiss to his bruised cheek, just as Maria always did when Lily got hurt. Alexander felt something break inside him then, some last defense that he'd been maintaining against feeling too much, caring too deeply. He gathered Lily into his arms, and then somehow Maria was there too, and the three of them were holding each other in the middle of his kitchen while police officers worked around them, while the morning sun streamed through the windows, while the world slowly righted itself. "The police say we can leave the mansion for a few days while they finish processing the scene," Maria said eventually, pulling back slightly, but not completely away. "I was thinking I could take Lily to my cousin's place in Queens, just until—" "No," Alexander said immediately. "You're not going anywhere. I mean," he paused, trying to organize thoughts that felt scattered. "I have a property in Connecticut. A smaller place, very secure. Please come with me. Both of you." "I can't," his voice caught. "I can't be apart from you right now. I need to know you're safe." Maria searched his face, and something passed between them in that moment, something unspoken but understood. "Okay," she said softly. "We'll come with you." 2 hours later, after giving preliminary statements to the police and gathering essential belongings, they left the mansion. Alexander's remaining security team, Rodriguez and 3 carefully vetted men, escorted them to a black SUV with tinted windows. During the drive to Connecticut, Lily fell asleep in her car seat, exhausted by the disrupted night and the strange excitement of the morning. Maria sat beside her daughter, while Alexander was in the front passenger seat, but he kept turning around to look at them, as if needing to confirm they were really there, really safe. "The 911 operator played me the recording," Detective Chin had told him before they left. "The call that your daughter made," she'd stopped herself, correcting. "That Ms. Sanchez's daughter made. It probably saved your life, Mr. Blackwood. Without that call, without police arriving when they did, Marcus and his men would have taken you to that warehouse with much more time to, well, it doesn't bear thinking about." Alexander had looked at Lily then, this tiny child who had accidentally become a hero, and felt a surge of emotions so powerful it had nearly brought him to his knees. The Connecticut property was a farmhouse set on 30 acres of rolling hills, with gardens that Maria immediately declared beautiful, and a barn that Alexander thought might be fun for Lily to explore once things settled down. It was the house he'd grown up in, actually, inherited from his parents and kept maintained but rarely visited because the memories there were complicated. But now, walking up to the front porch with Maria and Lily, it felt different. It felt like it might become something new. That first day was strange, all of them exhausted but unable to sleep, running on adrenaline and relief, and the odd giddiness that comes from surviving something terrible. They ordered pizza because no one felt like cooking. They watched animated movies that Lily picked because no one could focus on anything complex. They existed together in the same space, processing trauma in proximity. That night, after Lily was asleep in one of the upstairs bedrooms, Maria and Alexander sat on the porch, wrapped in blankets against the autumn chill, not speaking but not needing to. Finally, Maria broke the silence. What happens now? Alexander considered the question. Marcus and Vincent will face federal charges. Kidnapping, home invasion, assault, conspiracy. They'll likely spend the next 20 years in prison. I meant with us, Maria clarified softly. With this. She gestured between them, encompassing the strange intimacy that had developed between employer and employee, the way he'd fought for them, the way she'd waited for him. I don't know, Alexander admitted. I just know that when I thought I might never see you or Lily again, when I was sitting in that warehouse waiting to see if Marcus would actually pull the trigger, the only thing I could think about was how much I'd missed by keeping everyone at arm's length. How much I'd missed by being alone. Maria turned to look at him, her dark eyes reflecting starlight. You don't have to be alone, Alexander. It was the first time she'd used his first name, and hearing it in her voice felt significant, felt like crossing a threshold. I'm your employer, he said, voicing the obvious complication. This could be complicated, inappropriate even. The power dynamic is something we can navigate if we choose to, Maria finished. If we want to. But only if we both want to. I want to, Alexander said immediately, then laughed at his own eagerness. I very much want to. Maria smiled, and in that smile was the promise of something new, something neither of them had expected, but both of them needed. They didn't kiss that night. They didn't make grand declarations. They simply sat together under the stars, two people who had survived something terrible and found something precious in the process. And upstairs, Lily slept peacefully, her small hand clutching her stuffed rabbit, completely unaware that she'd saved everyone's lives with an accidental phone call. But she'd know someday. They'd tell her the story when she was older, about the night she became a hero without even trying. For now, though, she was just a 2-year-old girl, safe and loved, dreaming whatever dreams toddlers dream. And that was more than enough. 3 months later, life had settled into a new rhythm, one that none of them could have imagined during those terrifying hours in the darkness. The mansion in Manhattan remained Alexander's primary residence, but security had been completely overhauled. Rodriguez had personally vetted every single person who had access to the property. New systems had been installed, ones without any vulnerabilities that former employees might exploit. And most significantly, the East Wing where Maria and Lily had lived in separate quarters had been reconfigured. Now, they occupied the entire second floor of the main house. Alexander had insisted on it, had personally overseen the renovations. Maria's bedroom was spacious and filled with morning light, with an adjoining room for Lily that was painted in soft yellows and decorated with hand-painted murals of fairy tale characters. There was a playroom, a small kitchen where Maria could prepare Lily's snacks, and most importantly, it all connected to the main house in a way that said, "You belong here." The change in their relationship had been gradual but inevitable. What had started as comfort in shared trauma had deepened into something neither of them had been looking for, but both desperately needed. Alexander found himself rearranging his schedule around Lily's nap time and bedtime. He'd turn down late meetings, would leave the office by 5 so he could be home for dinner. His board members were baffled by the change. The Alexander Blackwood they'd known would work until midnight and consider anything else a waste of productive hours. But Alexander had learned something important in that warehouse. With a gun to his head and his life potentially measured in minutes, success meant nothing if you had no one to share it with. Now, on a bright Saturday morning in February, Alexander stood in the mansion's renovated kitchen, attempting to make pancakes. Maria had gone to visit her cousin in Queens for a few hours, entrusting Lily to his care, a gesture of trust that he didn't take lightly. Lily sat at the kitchen island on a high stool, her legs swinging, watching his efforts with the critical eye of a discerning food critic. "Mr. Alex," she said seriously. She'd never quite managed to stop calling him Mr. Alex, despite his attempts to convince her to drop the Mr. That one burning. Alexander quickly flipped the pancake, revealing a surface that was indeed far too brown. "You're absolutely right. Quality control is important." Lily giggled, a sound that never failed to make him smile. She was 3 years old now, her vocabulary expanding daily, her personality emerging in delightful and occasionally challenging ways. She had her mother's determination and kindness, but she'd also developed a stubborn streak that Alexander secretly thought she might have learned from him. "Tell story," Lily requested, as she did most mornings now. "Tell about night I was hero." They'd finally told her a simplified version of what had happened, that some bad men had tried to hurt Mr. Alex, but Lily had pressed the emergency button and called the police, saving everyone. They'd made it less scary, had framed it as an adventure, with a happy ending. Lily loved the story, loved knowing she'd done something important even though she didn't remember it at all. "Well," Alexander began, setting the questionable pancake aside and starting a new one. "On that night, there were some people who wanted to do bad things. But you, Pequena, were very brave. Even though you were sleepy, you helped your mama call for help. You were the hero of the whole story." "Like princess?" Lily asked hopefully. She was currently in a princess phase, much to Alexander's amusement. "Better than a princess," Alexander assured her. "You were a superhero." This seemed to satisfy her, and she returned her attention to the pancakes, offering commentary on each one's appearance and suggesting that maybe, they should order breakfast instead. Alexander was laughing at this suggestion when Maria returned home earlier than expected, carrying grocery bags and wearing an expression that was both nervous and excited. "You're back early," Alexander said, moving to help her with the bags. "Everything okay?" "Everything's fine," Maria said, setting the groceries on the counter. I have something I want to talk to you about." Something in her tone made Alexander pause. Lily, sensing important adult conversation, hopped down from her stool and wandered into the adjacent playroom, where her toys awaited. "What's wrong?" Alexander asked, concerned now. "Nothing's wrong," Maria said quickly. "It's just my cousin mentioned something today. Her friend works for an organization that helps undocumented immigrants get legal status, and she asked if I'd ever considered applying for a better visa. And I realized," she paused, meeting his eyes. "I realized that I've been afraid to even think about it. Afraid to hope for that kind of stability." Alexander felt his heart clench. He knew Maria's status was complicated. She'd come to the country on a tourist visa that had long since expired, had been living in the shadows, always one encounter with authorities away from deportation. "I want to help," he said immediately. "Whatever you need, lawyers, documentation, financial support, it's yours." "I know," Maria said softly. "You've already done so much for us, Alexander. But this is something I need to figure out myself. I need to know that I can stand on my own, that I'm not just dependent." He understood what she wasn't saying, that their relationship, which had grown from employer-employee to something much more profound, needed to be based on equality, not on power imbalance or financial necessity. "Then let me help you find the resources," he offered. "The best immigration lawyers, information about the process. But you'll make all the decisions. You'll be in control." Maria's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "Thank you." They stood there for a moment, and then Alexander did something he'd been wanting to do for weeks. He crossed the distance between them and kissed her, gently, asking rather than demanding, offering rather than taking. Maria kissed him back, her hands coming up to rest on his chest, and in that kiss was everything they hadn't said: gratitude and desire, hope and fear, past trauma and future possibilities. When they finally pulled apart, both slightly breathless, Lily's voice came from the playroom. "Mr. Alex kissing Mama?" They both laughed, the moment broken but not diminished. "Yes, Pequena," Maria called back. "Is that okay?" There was a pause, and then, "Okay, but still need breakfast." Over the following weeks, things continued to evolve. Maria began working with an immigration attorney, one of the best in New York, recommended by Alexander but paid for with money she'd been carefully saving. The process would be long and complicated, but for the first time, she had hoped that it might actually succeed. Alexander, meanwhile, was navigating his own changes. He'd become more involved in the day-to-day operations of his company, but also more willing to delegate, to trust others, to accept that he didn't have to control every aspect of his business to ensure its success. He'd also become deeply invested in philanthropy focused on helping families like Maria's, immigrants working hard to build better lives, single mothers struggling to provide for their children. He established a foundation with a significant portion of his wealth, focusing on legal aid, childcare support, and education access. When reporters asked about this shift in priorities, he gave vague answers about corporate responsibility. But the truth was simpler. He'd learned that wealth meant nothing if it didn't help the people you loved and the communities that sustain them. The trial of Marcus Hendricks and his accomplices was brief. The evidence was overwhelming: the 911 recording, the testimony from Maria and Alexander, the physical evidence from the mansion and warehouse. Marcus received 23 years in federal prison. Vincent Cole, who had cooperated with prosecutors, received 15 years. Alexander felt no satisfaction in their sentencing, only a weary relief that it was over. One evening in late spring, 6 months after that terrible night, Alexander was in a study working on foundation paperwork when Lily appeared in the doorway, her stuffed rabbit dragging behind her, as always. "Mr. Alex?" she said in her small voice. "You busy?" He immediately closed his laptop. "Never too busy for you, Pequena. What do you need?" Lily climbed into his lap with the unself-conscious ease of a child who knew she was wanted there. She was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Mr. Alex, you love Mama?" The question, so direct and innocent, took him by surprise. But he didn't hesitate in his answer. "Yes, I do. Very much." "You love me too?" she asked, looking up at him with those wide dark eyes that were so much like her mother's. "With all my heart," Alexander said, and meant it absolutely. This child, who had accidentally saved his life, who had filled his empty mansion with laughter and chaos and joy, who had taught him that love didn't have to be earned or protected or rationed. Yes, he loved her completely. Lily seemed satisfied with this answer. She snuggled against his chest and announced, "Then you should marry Mama. That's what people do when they love." Alexander laughed, delighted by her simple logic. "You know what, Pequena? You might be right about that." And 3 months later, on a perfect summer day in the gardens of the Connecticut farmhouse, that's exactly what happened. It was a small wedding, just close friends and family, Maria's cousin and parents who had flown in from Mexico, some of Alexander's trusted colleagues, and the security team that had become like family. Rodriguez served as best man, and Lily was the flower girl, taking her job with the utmost seriousness as she scattered petals down the makeshift aisle. When Maria walked toward him in a simple white dress that took his breath away, Alexander thought about the journey that had brought them here. The unexpected beginning when he'd hired a housekeeper who needed to bring her daughter to work. The growing connection he'd tried to ignore. The terrible night that had forced them all to confront what really mattered. And Lily, sweet Lily, who had saved them all without even trying, who had brought light into his darkness, who was even now beaming up at him as if he'd hung the moon just for her. When the officiant asked if anyone objected to the union, Lily's voice rang out, "I not object. I think a good idea." The crowd erupted in laughter, and Alexander grinned at his soon-to-be daughter, who waved at him cheerfully. "I love you," he said to Maria as they exchanged vows, his voice thick with emotion. "You and Lily saved me in every way a person can be saved." "We saved each other," Maria corrected, tears streaming down her face. "We're family now. We're home." And later, as they danced under string lights while Lily twirled nearby with her rabbit, Alexander reflected on how wrong he'd been about everything. He'd thought success meant wealth and power. He'd thought safety meant isolation. He'd thought love was a weakness to be avoided. But a 28-year-old housekeeper and her 2-year-old daughter had taught him the truth. That real success was measured in moments of connection, that real safety came from trusting others, and that love, messy, complicated, wonderful love, was the only thing that truly mattered. Marcus Hendricks had tried to destroy him that night in the darkness. But instead, he'd given Alexander the greatest gift. He'd forced him to recognize what he'd been missing, what he'd been too afraid to reach for. A family, a home, a future filled with possibility. And it had all been saved by a sleepy toddler who'd pressed a button and accidentally called for help. Sometimes, Alexander thought as he watched his wife and daughter laughing together, heroes come in the smallest packages. And sometimes, The darkest moments lead to the brightest new beginnings. Years later, when Lily was old enough to fully understand the story of that night, she would ask her parents about it. And they would tell her the complete truth about fear and courage, about sacrifice and love, about how sometimes the smallest actions have the biggest consequences. And Lily would smile and say she didn't remember any of it, but she was glad she'd pressed that button anyway. Because some families are born, and some families are forged in fire and darkness, and then rebuilt in light. Both kinds are precious. Both kinds are worth fighting for. And the Blackwood family, Alexander, Maria, and Lily, would spend the rest of their lives proving that every single day.